As many of you know, Barb and I moved here just shy of 2 years ago now from the fabled land of Vermont. There was a story we heard when we first moved up there about a Vermont dairy farmer who traveled out to Texas to meet his second cousin who had a huge ranch, a cattle ranch in Texas. The rancher showed his second cousin his giant house and his giant fleet of vehicles. And then he brought him to his big old tractor and said, "If I start heading out along the fence line to check out..."
Southern accent.
Southern accent. I'm sorry, I get them mixed up. I'll get the text. If I go out...
There you go.
...on my tractor and go check the fence line all around the perimeter of my ranch, it'll take me 12 hours to get all the way around the property. And a Vermont dairy farmer listens, nods his head and says, "Yeah, I had a tractor like that once."
Depending on what part of the country you're in, farming, ranching is very different. And there are ranches out in the West. It's not uncommon for them to be thousands of acres. And so how do you keep your cows together in a ranch that big? One obvious way is to put a fence around it. But the problem with fences is they're always breaking. And so if you put a fence around your enormous ranch, then you spend a lot of time writing fence, looking for the breaks, fixing them. As one rancher said, "I'm not a rancher, I'm a fence mender. That's all I do all day long." And so there's another way to keep your cows in one place, keep your cattle, they call them cattle in Texas, right? In one place. And that's to not pay so much attention to the fence, but to put a well in the center of where you want them to be. And to put the grain that you're feeding the cattle into the center of where you want them to be, and the cattle are drawn to that space. Then you don't have to spend your time being a fence mender. Then you can actually be a rancher.
Now, communities of human beings, I guess, aren't that radically different from communities of cattle. You can determine who's in and who's out by a fence or a wall that we can put around a community.
The rules.
They can be literal fences or literal walls, or they can be rules that are imposed. That everyone on this side of the wall is going to look this way, or believe this way, or behave this way. And people outside the wall are going to look and behave and believe differently. That's called a bounded community. We talked about this about 1.5 years ago in a sermon. It's called bounded community. There's an external boundary that determines how people look in or out. The alternative there, like it is with the cattle, is you can determine who wants to be part of a community by an attractor at the center, whether it's a watering hole for cattle or, with human beings, putting at the center some ideal, a common vision, a common sense of possibility, a common purpose, or a person who can attract. These are called a centered community. It's not about keeping the right people in and the wrong people out. It's about drawing all in and letting them choose their priorities, where to be, how to be. You're not worrying about how they dress, how they look, how they believe. but are they attracted to the same ideal that brings you there as well?
And so when Jesus talks about being the good shepherd, he says, the sheep know my voice and come to me, follow me. That's a centered community. It's not that there isn't a sheepfold, but Jesus says, I am the gate, and you get the sense that it's a gate that's wide open so that people can come in and go out at any time. Jesus has an open and a centered community. And it's fascinating to me that he talks about being the shepherd whose voice people hear. And he talks about this open gate right after the story of him healing the man who was blind from birth. We preached on that about 6 weeks ago. You may or may not have been here. You may or may not remember anything that we said.
But it was brilliant. They must have remembered it.
But the TLDR of what's a very long story is that Jesus healed a man who was blind, and he healed him on the Sabbath, and the Pharisees got really upset. They were mad because Jesus did healing on the Sabbath, which was work, which was against the rules. And they got mad at this man for insisting that his healing was more important than the Sabbath rules, and they end up throwing him out of the temple. And it's right after that Jesus talks about being the shepherd.
Now, in their defense, the Pharisees were deeply concerned about the rules of religious holiness for some very good reasons. Not because they were horrible, judgmental people or the snidely whiplash caricatures that we have for them in the Christian church. But it's because they were trying to maintain a holy and faithful and authentically Jewish presence in the midst of a hostile, imperialist, pagan environment. And they believed that God's will, God's law, God's Torah was essential to the preservation of Israel under Roman occupation. That's how they would maintain being a distinct and holy people. So Pharisees were understandably concerned about who was obeying the religious rules or not, who was pure and who was unclean, who was in and who was out. In our ranching metaphor, the Pharisees spent a lot of time riding the fence, mending any holes they found, and making sure the right cattle were on the inside and the wrong cattle were on the outside. And from their point of view, it seemed like this upstart rabbi from the North Country was making holes in the fences, healing people any old time, letting folks in or out, whether they were ritually pure or not. It was crazy making for them.
Jesus, like the Pharisees, was concerned with making holy and faithful people. But rather than paying attention to the fence, Jesus was more concerned that people be shaped by God's mercy and wholeness and inclusion rather than by the rule following. Jesus was less concerned about who is in and who is out than he was about throwing open the doors to anyone who had been left out of God's grace up until then. I am the gate, he said. Those who enter will be saved, and they'll come in and go out and have pasture. I came that they might have abundant life. The only rule Jesus was about was the rule of love, which branches pretty quickly into the rules about life and grace and justice. That love, the voice of the Good Shepherd, we find ourselves drawn to that almost magically. And as we get drawn in toward Jesus, we find that we get closer to each other as well. As we get closer to the center, our connections with each other grow. We inevitably draw together when we draw toward Jesus. And through the open gate, we're then able to go out and share that love and that justice and that grace with all the world and draw them toward Jesus too.
Jesus said, I am the gate. Come in and go out and find pasture. It's startlingly open and free invitation to come in and out, to bring our whole selves to God, to find the love that makes us whole, and to go out to share that love with others. It's incredibly exciting. It's incredibly freeing, and it makes possible the kind of radical community that's described in Acts chapter 2. All who believed were together and had all things in common. They would sell their possessions and goods and distribute the proceeds to all as any had need. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and fellowship, to the breaking of bread and the prayers, with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having the goodwill of all the people. Sociologists and church historians say that that was the nature of the earliest infant church in its early days for a century or two before things started getting a little institutionalized.
And sadly, the church has not kept that openness over the last 2,000 years. Too much of our history has been about the establishing of walls, making Jesus not into a gate, but into a wall that holds some people in and excludes others. Endless councils have been held, some at sword point. Wars have been fought, inquisitions have been established, all in the name of determining who it is that should be in and who it is that should be outside, and never the twain shall meet. Any attempt to move into more inclusive, more open ways of being church requires us to acknowledge and confess that history that is ours, and to reckon with what has often been the horrible results: pogroms and lynchings and genocide and expulsions and suicide. It's precisely the opposite of what Jesus had in mind, I believe, when he said that he was the gate where all could come in and go out. It's the opposite of what he intended when he said that his voice was the voice of the shepherd, and the sheep could hear and follow his voice to life and to love.
It must be 37 years ago when you and I had just met.
Right?
Barb and I were theology students at Boston University's School of Theology across the river, and we got invited to be part of an educational trip to Israel-Palestine over Christmas break. It was educational.
Right. In more ways than we expected.
We witnessed some big stuff while we were there, including the beginning of the First Intifada.
Which literally started while we were in Jerusalem.
While we were there.
It's interesting.
We also witnessed some intimate stuff. The fragile beauty of the Galilean hillsides and the gentle people who lived there, including, and this was another learning experience, including a young Palestinian shepherd boy who was leading his sheep across a busy road with a line of tourist buses impatiently trying to cross. And this young kid was leading a flock across. But the sheep didn't exactly follow his voice. He didn't call, he didn't yell at all. He had a whistle. And I can't do it because one of my great regrets in life is never learning how to do a proper...
No, but he had a whistle.
Oh, he had a whistle.
He played a tune.
He had a tune.
Yeah.
Like a penny whistle, I remember. He whistled to call his flock. And the translator on our tourist bus said that each shepherd had a distinctive tune, a distinctive whistle that they would use to call their flock. And they would follow that sound safely across the road even with a line of buses loaded with tourists impatiently waiting to get back on their way. So when Jesus says, I call my own sheep by name, and they hear my voice, they will follow me because they know my voice, or maybe my whistle, or maybe my guitar chord, or maybe that sound beyond sound that echoes in your heart. How do we hear that voice? What whistle tune does Jesus blow to summon your spirit? What is the name that Jesus calls you? What is the name that Jesus calls me? Calls you?
I would say that the name that Jesus calls me is not Barb. Barb is a perfectly good name. The name that Jesus calls me is something deeper. I'm not sure it's something I could pronounce. It comes out of the great silence that I think all of us come out of. What I know is that I recognize that call that draws me in closer and closer to his love, that draws me in closer and closer to the Spirit's tending of me, to her great wrapping of arms around me. And as I draw close to Jesus, as I follow that name, I also draw close to a church community that's also trying to listen for the voice of Jesus, to draw each of you close. We don't always do it perfectly. And we do our best to do it with integrity and to do it together, to join that deep yearning of all of our hearts, to listen for that name that tells us again and again, you are mine, you are beloved, follow me.
Here is what Jesus' voice is not. It's never the voice that tells you that you are a mistake, that you have no place on this earth or in this community, that somehow who you are is basically wrong. Even when those voices of exclusion and fear and judgment claim to be the church, they are in reality the thieves and the bandits that come to steal and devour the searching sheep. We need to recognize the sound of the shepherd, and sometimes in spite of the church.
It's a lifelong process, this learning to hear Jesus' voice to each one of us. It's a lifetime process to learn how to follow that love and live in that love. Maybe that's a good definition of what spirituality is. Getting centered enough inside to listen for Christ's voice or whistle or whatever, maybe in the usual places, maybe from entirely unexpected people and places.
Maybe that's a good definition of what discipleship is. That as we each draw closer to the voice of Jesus, we also draw closer to each other, and together we create beloved communities of caring, bringing healing and reconciliation to hurting people and to a scarred earth. No one is forgotten in Christ's green pastures. Nothing is disposable in God's good creation. All is sacred and precious, as the wise words of Chief Seattle said.
And so our prayer for you, for us this morning, is that you might know better and better that gentle voice that calls you in through a gate that is always open and welcoming, that says, come in and go out and find pasture.
Our prayer for Harvard-Epworth is that it may become more and more a people and a place that embraces all the people who are yearning to hear Jesus call their name. And we pray that we can offer Jesus' open gate of love and justice where all can come in and go out and find pasture and healing and love.